I thought about doing something weird or different for this episode. Maybe instead of playing the game normally, I do some kind of fancy challenge run. Or I might have recorded the whole thing, and then just played the whole game in fast forward with no cuts. But no, I felt it was best to just stick with my usual format, even if this is a game that I think everyone who watches videos about Famicom games would be extremely familiar with. As strange as it may be, this marks the final game that Nintendo published for the Famicom. The original Zelda no Densetsu was a launch title for the Famicom Disk System, all the way back in 1986. The sequel was also a Disk System game, which is why the first appearance of Zelda in Famidaily is 1,037 episodes in. Despite the Famicom being Nintendo's own platform, they weren't the biggest publisher of games for the system. Nintendo published 51 Famicom cartridges, and that's including the two Family Basic versions. Konami and Namco both beat that total. The majority of Nintendo's games were released in the first few years of the Famicom's life, basically getting the system off the ground. After Super Mario Bros., they took a 2-year-long break from any releases for the system, instead focusing their efforts on the Famicom Disk System. And that's kind of how it went for the Famicom's life. Nintendo's energies were always focused on the next system. So as their efforts for the Disk System petered out, they started pushing the Game Boy, and then the Super Famicom, and then the Nintendo PlayStation, though that one backfired on them. In the 90s, Nintendo started putting some software effort into the Famicom again, mainly using it as a test bed for new concepts and developers. It's the early years of the Famicom, though, that stick in the minds of players in Japan. The time of things like Excite Bike and Ice Climbers. Those early, simple, arcade-style games. The original release of Zelda no Densetsu was the third best-selling Famicom Disk System game, right behind Super Mario Bros. 2 and Volleyball. And that game was absurdly influential. It felt like about half the games released in 1987 were trying to be Zelda no Densetsu. Whether it was directly copying the overhead view and dungeons, or if it was just focusing on the exploration and secrets. Everybody wanted to be the game that kids were figuring out on the playground. And as for the Zelda series, by 1994, the Super Famicom and Game Boy entries had been released. The series had evolved a lot, and here comes Nintendo putting out a cartridge version called Zelda no Densetsu 1. Yes, the 1 is actually part of the title for the Famicom version. And they didn't really make a whole lot of concessions from the disk system. The audio is scaled back, since the Famicom lacks the additional channels, but that's the only significant change I could spot. They didn't even remove the parts that really relied on the microphone, even though the AV Famicom lacks a microphone. The story of Zelda no Densetsu 1 is that Princess Zelda has been abducted by the evil wizard Ganon, who has the Triforce of Power. He wanted the other Triforce, the Triforce of Wisdom, and so Zelda broke it into 8 parts, which were scattered across the kingdom. Weird how there's only 2 of them, but they call them Triforces. Well, I'm sure somebody got around to taking care of that eventually. As the hero Link, you'll have to explore everywhere, collect tools that will let you get deeper into dungeons, reassemble the Triforce, and then defeat Ganon. That feels like a concept you could build an enormous game franchise on. The challenge in Zelda no Densetsu 1 comes from the exploration. You're plopped down in the wilderness and told to get to it. Virtually every one of the 128 screens in the overworld has something for you to find. Maybe it's a shop that's out in the open, or it might be a secret passage where you'll find some money, or your choice of a healing potion or a permanent health upgrade. Of course, the only reason you'd ever go with the potion is if you're rushing through the game and you didn't want to spend money on that. Zelda no Densetsu 1 gives you an entire world to figure out. How can you find your way through the woods that repeat? How can you get the old woman to talk to you? Is it possible to defeat the ghost in the graveyard? Are the wand and book useful for anything? The answer to that one is no. Since the world is completely open to you, you can just walk up to any of the 8 dungeons. You don't have to do any of them in order. Now there are a couple of tools found in certain dungeons that you will have to have in order to complete other ones. If you don't have the bow found in Dungeon 1, then you can't defeat the crab monster. If you don't have the stepladder found in Dungeon 4, then there will be rooms in later dungeons that you can't cross. And if you don't have the raft found in Dungeon 3, then you can't get to Dungeon 4. But that said, a lot of the game is technically optional. I have gotten all the way to Ganon without picking up a sword. And one of my old favorite tricks was to go to Dungeon 8 almost immediately and get the infinite use key so that I don't have to worry about keys in other dungeons. You're free to approach Zelda Densetsu 1 in just about any way that you'd like. The difficulty isn't even linear. Dungeon 6 with its teleporting and rapid-firing whiz robes is a lot harder than Dungeon 7 with its hordes of boomerang throwers. And of course, the worst enemy in the game of all are the blue Dark Nuts, the knights who you can only hit from the back, but can instantaneously change direction to face you when you're attacking them. Although your options are nearly limitless, the world of Zelda no Densetsu 1 follows a few consistent rules to help you out. Secret passages in dungeons are always square in the middle of the wall. If something can be opened by pushing a block, it's always the same blocks, and you have to eliminate all of the enemies first. There's always a room in every dungeon square, even if there's a hole there. The game is rarely unfair to you, though there's definitely parts that could give you better information. That does take a bit of a turn after you complete the game, when a whole new quest opens up. It uses the same overworld map, and any place you can go into is still a place you can go into. But beyond that, everything is scrambled. And the dungeons have whole new layouts for you to follow. And those dungeons can be a bit unfair, since to get through some walls, you have to smash your face into them and hold for a while. But that's a second quest for people who have already mastered the first. So making the dungeon layouts and tricks harder feels appropriate. There are 3 battery save slots on Zelda no Densetsu 1, and you have the opportunity to save your game every time that you die. I haven't really been drilling into the mechanics of the game too hard. Part of that is I expect that most people watching this video are already familiar with them. You don't need me to tell you tricks like how you can hold on to keys and use them in other dungeons, or talk about how annoying it is when the flute warps you to Dungeon 7. And if you don't know those details, well, half the fun of Zelda no Densetsu 1 is exploring it and finding these out for yourself. I've barely scratched the surface with what I've been talking about. There's a lot more for you to find out. I don't think I need to say that this is a wildly popular game in Japan. I mean, it's one of the acknowledged masterpieces of the medium. It's video games Mona Lisa. People painted portraits before, but nobody painted a portrait quite like this. Strangely enough, Nintendo seemed to have been prepping this for release in 1992, probably around the time that they released Super Mario USA. All of the copyrights on the cartridge and in the game have been refreshed to 1992. Who can say why they decided to hold it back for 2 years? Of course, the next Zelda game after this would be the first 3D Zelda, a real dividing point in the series. And now that we're almost 9 minutes in here, I'm going to say something controversial. I think the 3D Zeldas are a lot worse than the 2D ones. One of the things that I enjoyed the most in the early games was the ability to just go wherever I want and see what I could figure out. And when the series moved to 3D, a lot of that got stripped away. I don't think the games are bad, it's just they weren't what I wanted out of a Zelda game. Fortunately for me, the last few Zelda releases have been much more in line with what I want. Zelda no Densetsu 1 has a lot of rough edges to modernize. It doesn't have much story, it doesn't offer you much direction, but it has a world within it. And it changed everything. Re-releasing it to make sure that it was out there for all Famicom players was the right choice for Nintendo's end on the Famicom.